So we're here to talk about the new trauma program that will be new for the Gestalt Center that you've developed, and that will start at the Gestalt Center for Psychotherapy and Training in fall of '09.
Right.
And as you know, and people may know, there are a couple of trauma programs in New York City. And so I think the first question is, how is this program different? Can you tell us something about the program, highlighting how it's different or how it's unique?
I've been specifically working with trauma and focused on it for the last 13 and a half, 14 years. And I'm aware of all the training programs presently in New York City as well as across the country. And I do a lot of work abroad. And that helped me to evolve the program for the Gestalt Center as well as the medical school at the National University of Brazil. There are a number of problems with the current training programs. First of all, if we look at the program at NYU, and they're all very respectable programs, but they have a community outlook. They go in when a community has had a natural disaster or active terrorism and so on, and get the community up and running again. But they're not really involved with ongoing daily one-to-one interactions with the individuals in the community. They just get the community functioning again. The aim of this program is to really train people with various backgrounds, certainly coming into the program as therapists or Gestalt therapists, but there are immigration lawyers, there are school teachers, there are first responders, there are ministers, all of whom will be interfacing with trauma. The goal of the program is to train you in what is trauma, how does it impact on you, what happens in the brain, what goes on with the brain chemistry, what goes on with the memory storage, what goes on with the central nervous system, because the person's response makes logical sense to us, but when we try more traditional ways then of approaching a traumatized person, we're very ineffective, because there's a whole other belief system, there's a whole other biochemical system that we need to understand how we work with it in order to be effective. And that's the main focus of the program, a real hands-on regardless of your background, of course practicing within the limitations of your expertise, but knowing what to do in a clinical way with ongoing work with people who've been traumatized.
So it sounds like you're also suggesting that trauma is an altered state. So in a way, how a person is when they're in their traumatic state or their traumatized state is different, and someone needs to understand that difference, which also suggests something that you have mentioned to me before about working with the sort of the helpers, the re-traumatization or secondary traumatization that happens, and maybe you could say something about the place of that.
Well, there are two things: that when you work with highly traumatized people, you're very much in danger of physical and emotional problems. When I was in Mexico and was working with 4 or 5 Mexican therapists, and I was there for 3 years, I instituted a whole series of things that all of us were supposed to do. I did mine. The other 4 therapists did not, and they all suffered a physical or psychological break for up to 3 to 6 months. Somewhere during that 3-year period, they just became totally neurologically overwhelmed.
In Gestalt therapy, we look at the whole person, but also in terms of the body, mind, emotions, spirit. And what I'm understanding is the importance of including the body as the ground for this work.
Right. It's like a fuse box. We shut off. So it's the body, it's the emotional brain, it's the central nervous system that is recording the ongoing trauma. And that's one of the problems with the other trauma training programs. They're all very respectable programs. However, they restrict their training to psychotherapists, and my feeling is that there are many people that work on the front lines that can benefit from this training, and it's really not rocket science. And the other problem is that all of the trainings are currently housed in psychoanalytically oriented institutions, and the first thing that shuts down is the intellectual brain. So it really is an emotional approach, a body approach. One of the great things about Gestalt is that that's part of your focus, to take in the entire person and their interaction with the surroundings. So I'm a trained psychoanalyst, but if a person was talking to me about trauma and their eyes darted to the right and down, I probably wouldn't even pay any attention to that. Now, in the trauma training, what you'd immediately know is to pay attention to that, which is part of the Gestalt sense of you're observing everything, because the person probably has a visual image they're not even aware of, that they're reviewing at the moment that they're getting upset or telling you about it. And some of the Gestalt techniques are very good at getting right into that information, where when you deal with trauma through academic learning, and from a psychoanalytic point of view, you don't have most of those other tools. And trauma is mostly stored in the non-intellectual areas of the brain. And as an analyst, you had a body because you walked in, but that's the last consideration we had in relationship to what was going on in your body.
So people who are trained in Gestalt would have a certain advantage in having some training and attending to the body. And is that some of what you would include in your training, because you're talking about training people for trauma too?
What's very important is before you even begin working with trauma, you really need to work with the person's resources. And part of the technique, neurobiological trauma resolution, that I've built up over many years of practice, infuses all of this awareness into working with the client, so that you can notice what resources, what's happening in their body. If they're not in their body, nothing you do is going to reach them. So how do you ground them? How do you focus them? And something I think we discussed is that they're very difficult clients to keep in your practice, because as soon as their anxiety builds, they begin to fear the fear of re-experiencing the trauma. And if you don't build resources to deal with that, they leave treatment very prematurely.
So that it fits into the Gestalt idea of support, of finding support and creating self-supports and environmental supports for
Exactly.
taking a risk. And initially, I guess initially you're talking about both. For some people, they feel they've had to do it themselves, so
Right.
there's been too much self-support that hasn't been grounded, and for others, a sense of giving it up.